I don't think it would be too strong to say that the scientific community was humiliated by this pandemic because they realized that they got it wrong.
On the morning of March 1918, a mess cook at Camp Funston in Kansas, Albert Gitchell, reported to the infirmary with a sore throat. By lunchtime, the infirmary was dealing with more than 100 similar cases, and in the weeks that followed, so many reported sick that the camp's chief medical officer requisitioned a hangar to accommodate them all. We're going to have a conversation today about a dreadful disease, but it's more than just the story of that disease that we're going to discuss with Laura Spinney, the author of Pale Rider, the Spanish Flu of 1918, and how it changed the world. We're going to talk about a bit about politics and science as well. So I'm very excited. Laura Spinney is a science journalist and a literary novelist. She has published 2 novels in English, and her writing on science has appeared in National Geographic, Nature, The Economist, The Telegraph, among others. She is the author of The Pale Rider, the Spanish Flu of 1918, and How It Changed the World. And she joins me on the podcast. Laura, thanks for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
It's a pleasure to be here.
In 1918, the world was greeted with a unkind, invisible visitor, an incredibly strong virus that we now commonly refer to as the Spanish flu. The scale was so global, it reached Americans and Africans, Spanish and Chinese, Brazilians and Russians, even Eskimos were affected. Could you talk about how strong it was and how fast it spread?
Sure. The Spanish flu killed, according to the latest estimates, between 50 and 100 million people in the world, which equates to roughly 2.5 to 5% of the global population. That's a large range, and the reason is that there's still a lot that's unknown about the flu, and that diagnosis at the time was pretty vague. But it gives you a fairly good idea of how dangerous it was. And to set those numbers in context, the previous flu pandemic, which was the Russian flu of the 1890s, killed around 1 million people. Mm-hmm. And the most lethal pandemic that we had in the 20th century post the Spanish flu was the Hong Kong flu, the so-called Hong Kong flu of 1968, which is thought to have killed around 4 million people. So it really was in a league of its own.
And therefore, can us as moderns even begin to understand the impact that this disease had?
That's a question that can be taken in lots of different ways, I suppose. I mean, the evidence is that we can't understand it or that we couldn't at the time because we seem to have forgotten about it. So the Spanish flu struck at a time when even doctors barely understood the concept of a virus, influenza obviously being a viral disease. Almost all the doctors in the world thought that it was a bacterial disease. And most people in the world were only recently acquainted with germ theory. That is the idea that germs, bacteria, and other microorganisms cause disease. It's important to take your mind back a century and to understand that a lot of people still thought of this as an act of God, as something they could do nothing about, a punishment for sins, something to be endured and not to be prevented or cured. And that actually coordinated pretty well with the facts because there was very little you could do about influenza in those days, even ordinary influenza, let alone a virulent one like this. Just remember that there were no antibiotic drugs, and what most victims of the Spanish flu died of were not the flu itself, but secondary complications, mainly bacterial pneumonia. There were no antivirals. Those arrived even later in the clinic than antibiotics, so around the 1960s. And there certainly was no flu vaccine. So the only thing that really made any difference in saving lives was careful nursing, making sure that the patient was kept hydrated and warm and fed. And apart from that, there was and some public health measures which could make a difference. there was very little that doctors could do. So the impact was horrendous, as the numbers suggest.
And it even, there was very little other than, as you say, nursing and milk. They suggested, the drinking of milk, and then milk supplies would run out, and the staff of nurses would run out as some of them get the flu. William Carlos Williams, the poet and doctor, talks about how many in his profession were getting this flu. It was just so strong that it starts to impact the providers as well.
Absolutely. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that doctors and nurses and ordinary people didn't do their utmost to try and help the sick and the dying. They tried everything, literally everything. Some of their remedies were very outlandish indeed. Even in Switzerland, which you might think of as a fairly advanced country, people were sort of lighting aromatic fires in front of their homes to clear the noxious air. And that's an idea that harks back to the Middle Ages, when people thought that noxious air or miasma caused disease. So that gives an indication both of how desperate they were, how few effective interventions they had to hand, and also how scared they were.
You have a line in the book that you say, this flu hit in a time of quantum physics and also witches, where automobiles were available, but horses were still being used as transportation. Quite a world for such an advanced disease to hit.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, you could always describe the planet as sort of torn between pre-modern and modern ages, depending on your definition of modern. But it was a real turning point between a sort of more mystical age, pre-Darwinian age, and a more scientific post-Darwinian age. I mean, Darwin was writing about his revolutionary ideas more than half a century earlier, but obviously such ideas take a long time to trickle down to the ordinary man or woman. And
let's get this Spanish thing out of the way. It's called the Spanish flu, but that's just one of these things that seems to be so common. There people will say that the Dutch treat and things like this. We're always naming things after someone who is not us. Is that what happened? It's not really Spain, where,
as you gathered, it's a misnomer. We always like to blame the other person, and as I've already said, people really didn't know where this disease came from. They had to blame someone. The reason it was blamed on the poor old Spanish, who really had nothing to do with its origins, was politics, really. Spain was neutral in the war, and so unlike the hostile nations, it didn't censor its press. And it wrote about the flu when it experienced its first cases. It reported on those cases, and among them was the King of Spain, whose case was obviously very visible. So that story appeared in the newspapers. People read about it in Spain and abroad, and it seemed to the rest of the world that the flu was sort of rippling out from Madrid, and that's how it caught that name. When in fact it had been in the States, certainly, and probably in Britain and France much earlier.
And in our memory, to the extent there is any knowledge of the Spanish flu, it's taught often as an adjunct to World War I. It's still somewhat tempting for folks like myself, man of peace, and I'd like to give World War I one more impact to urge the caution of war, because things like this can happen. But you do cast some doubt on that, whether perhaps the war was the factor that caused the influenza, or whether it was something that just would have happened in any case.
Well, let's say that we haven't quite worked out the entire mechanisms of why the Spanish flu erupted when it did, or why it was so virulent, so much more virulent than any other flu pandemic in the history of humanity. But it does look as if the war had something to do with it in this sense. New strains of flu virus occasionally spill over from other animal species into the human species and cause a pandemic. We have had flu pandemics outside of wartime. But the current thinking is that it was the sort of synergy of that event and the First World War that created such a lethal pandemic in 1918. And certainly there was something very anomalous about it, 50 to 100 million dead compared to 1 million dead in the pandemic that happened 20 years earlier, though the global population hadn't increased very much more, is something that needs to be explained. the thinking at the moment is that the flu emerged into a world that was in a very exceptional state. That is, it was at war. Large amounts of people were experiencing famine. Large amounts of people were displaced and on the move. And in the trenches of the Western Front in Europe, lots of young men in a fairly lamentable physical state were packed together, their lungs compromised by gas, by mustard gas and other things. And they made very easy targets for a novel respiratory disease. And they also provided an unusual situation for that virus, because it's often said that the best strategy in evolutionary terms for a virus is to moderate its virulence so that its hosts stay alive for long enough to travel and spread it further. But in this case, that wasn't possible, because if you think of it reaching the trenches of the Western Front, those men were packed together into trenches. They weren't very mobile at all. They were dying of other things before they could die of flu, mainly flying bullets. So in that sort of very unusual situation, it might have been a better evolutionary strategy for the virus to be extremely virulent and kill its hosts fast and spread through them without worrying about how long they stayed alive. When I say worry, I obviously don't mean that this virus has a strategy in the conscious sense, but that's the best way that it will survive and go on to reproduce, which is what you might call an evolutionary strategy. So that might be one explanation for why it was so virulent, and why the Western Front may have contributed to the sort of ratcheting up of that virulence, and then to the spread of a very virulent strain once the armistice was signed and those men were demobilized and the survivors went back to the four corners of the earth, where they were welcomed at homecoming parties by joyous crowds of civilians.
And it's interesting what you say that a virus has no conscience, a virus has no thought, it doesn't have any politics, it doesn't plan anything, but everything around it, that and the steps that we take, do contain the political consequences. The virus, in a sense, might render things visible. One of them is an additional impact of war, more deaths than the World War I itself, and almost approaching, just a matter of the estimates not being clear, the deaths of World War II.
I think that's a very important point. When we think about the danger of future pandemics, we tend to focus on the virus itself. Where will it come from? How will we contain it? And that sort of thing. We very rarely, or we're less likely to look at the role of the interaction with the host. What kind of a world will it merge into? What are the inequalities in this world in terms of healthcare and access to medicine and social status and wealth and diet and so on, that will have an impact on how fast that virus travels across the world, how virulent it will be, and how many people will die ultimately.
I think that often with the advances in being able to identify a virus and to see things that we were unable to see even at the time that these people existed in, we've sort of become fascinated with that process, and necessarily so, in understanding viral mechanisms. But I do find it's interesting that maybe on the political science side that the interest in that sort of thing, there's always political support for building the best laboratory and the best medical university and the knowledge, and there's a lot of sort of bipartisan and all-partisan support for that. But when it comes to public health measures, those are not often saluted as well. Viruses like this must be around or their potential must be there, but we haven't had such an outbreak.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about the fact that we now have a flu vaccine, the vaccine is getting better every year, and that's in itself is no mean feat, because the vaccine has to evolve in order to match the evolving flu virus. But our best protection in the case of a future flu pandemic is going to be high herd immunity, the fact that a good proportion of the population is vaccinated against that disease. And that involves two elements. The first is having an effective flu vaccine, and the second is making sure that enough people receive it. And people won't, First of all, we have to make sure that enough people have access to the vaccine, but we also have to ensure that those people are informed about what it can do for them, that it's not dangerous, or that the benefits outweigh the risks. And they have to trust the people who are telling them this. So there's an issue of medical education, of public education, which is almost as important as the rest.
And you would be a proponent, go and get the flu vaccine.
I absolutely would. And not just for yourself and your family, but for society at large. It's very important to understand a flu pandemic as not just a biological phenomenon, but a social one, as I hope my book shows.
I want to talk a bit about go back to a bit about to 1918 and how far it spread. I mean, we talked about that even some communities like the Aleutian Islands, the Eskimos, that there were thoughts that, oh, well, they won't be hit by this. The Chinese, though they're so far away from the Western Front, say, I believe Australia tries a quarantine policy and maybe has some minimal success. Some towns in Spain that try quarantines and are as successful as they're able to accomplish it. I wish you would talk a bit about how far around the globe this virus spread.
So it's funny because if you look at the photos related to the pandemic that circulate on the web and in the press, anyone would think that it only affected America and Europe, and even more narrowly one sort of military camp in the Midwest. Unfortunately, that we don't have many photographs from that time relevant to the pandemic. But the fact is that it infected the entire globe, with very few exceptions. I think St. Helena at the Atlantic was one of them. There's an island in the Amazon. Almost nowhere escaped. Australia was an interesting case because seeing the second wave, that of the autumn, the northern hemisphere autumn of 1918 wave, approach across time and space, this wave being the most lethal of the three, they put in place a maritime quarantine. So all the ships arriving at Australian ports were quarantined before their personnel crew were allowed to land. And that kept that autumn wave out of Australia, which was an amazing accomplishment, really. Unfortunately, the Australians lifted the quarantine after the autumn wave had passed. And so the third wave of the pandemic, which arrived in the following January 1919 we're talking about, did get into Australia. It was not as virulent as the autumn wave, but it still claimed around 12,000 Australian lives. It was global and almost nowhere escaped. And in fact, the more isolated regions were almost always the most vulnerable, probably because of lack of historical exposure to the flu, and so the immune systems of people in those places weren't primed. But often in those places there was also poorer access to healthcare, more poverty, social exclusion, and those sorts of problems just exacerbated the ones caused by isolation. And you gave the example of Eskimos. Alaska, which was at the time a US territory, not a full state, was quite badly affected. The worst affected region was Bristol Bay, which lost a staggering 40% of its population. So although the United States as a whole got off relatively lightly, there were parts of it that were very badly affected indeed.
And a reminder to my listeners that I'm speaking with Laura Spinney, the author of Pale Rider, the Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World. Two of the revelations of the book, one that you get beyond what's available through the evidence of photography and talk about the world and how far this disease reached. And secondly, talk about the number of waves. It wasn't just one and then, oh, good, we dodged it, it's over. This thing sort of came back.
Yeah, it took the world by surprise. So in terms of timings, I'll talk about the Northern Hemisphere because obviously the seasons work differently below the equator. But in the Northern Hemisphere, the Spanish flu first emerged in the spring of 1918. That first wave was relatively mild, not much to distinguish it from a seasonal flu. It receded in the early summer of 1918. And most of that summer was flu-free. But when it came back in the last days of August, early September, it was almost unrecognizable. It seemed to people to be a completely other disease. There were even comparisons with the Black Death. Mm-hmm. It was very much more lethal. This was the second autumn wave, which receded towards the end of the year. And then there was a third wave in the spring, early months of 1918, which was sort of intermediate between the other two in terms of virulence.
This world, we are on, we're talking about 1918, we're on the cusp of modernity. Things are starting to get automated, electricity, automobiles. Yeah, talk about perhaps the impact of this disease on fostering science, if that occurred.
Absolutely, it occurred. I mean, I don't think it would be too strong to say that the scientific community was humiliated by this pandemic because they realized that they got it wrong. Virology took off in the years following the pandemic. The first viruses were discovered in the closing days of the 19th century, but they didn't really take up much psychic space by 1918. Most diseases were blamed on bacteria. Most infectious diseases. Even old age was being blamed on bacteria by the time the Spanish flu came along. When they saw that their vaccines, which were antibacterial, were almost completely ineffective, doctors went back to the drawing board, if you like. And even in the midst of the pandemic, they were making experiments to see if perhaps they'd been wrong about a bacterial cause, and trying to find if there was something else, something smaller, because viruses are in general smaller than bacteria, that might have been the true cause. It wasn't until the 1930s that they definitively proved that, demonstrated that flu was caused by a virus. But it was definitely the Spanish flu that stimulated that. And in fact, Jonas Salk, who famously developed the polio vaccine, he became interested in viruses in those post-Spanish flu years when all the virologists of his generation in his home city, New York, were trying to solve the mystery of the Spanish flu.
Check out www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com for articles on the Spanish flu of 1918 and a link to Laura Spinney's book. And it's interesting, yes, in plagues and viruses of past. I'm thinking of something we talked about on this program in the past is the Philadelphia yellow fever of 1793, because it coincided with the beginnings of the early American Republic and almost devastated members of that government. It's on our minds. And, there's certainly, during that time was a lot of blaming it on morality. There was a preacher saying, see, you allowed actors and theaters in Philadelphia, and now look what God has wrought. I'm sure there was some of that in 1918. Do you have any sense of it kind of in the history of that time? And maybe it's not something that we have, but that we can get a grasp of, but of the battle between, hey, this disease is based on the morality and all those things we hear quite often, and the science, and saying, okay, we've got to figure out how to deal with this scientifically. Was the science side starting to win there, and the other mostly being left off at 1918, or was it still a struggle?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. Is science ever really free of political thought or cultural bias? Should we look at ourselves today and ask ourselves that question? Back in 1918, it certainly wasn't. At that time, eugenics was very much a mainstream school of thought, and a lot of powerful people in the world, and even less powerful people, and a lot of doctors believed firmly that Darwin's ideas applied to human societies as well, and that some human beings were stronger and more destined to survive than others, and that the ones that were at the bottom of the pile were doomed to die of dangerous infectious diseases, among other causes, because they were inherently inferior, and there was nothing you could do about that. So yes, that whole eugenics, I don't want to call it a philosophy. I don't want to dignify it with that name, because obviously it was thoroughly discredited later on. But it was a school of thought that was extremely influential, and that coloured immigration policies. It coloured public health policies. There was sort of an idea that the superior classes needed to be separated from the inferior ones in order not to be contaminated with their diseases.
Yeah, I mean, I think often where it's science versus non-science, but it's also favoring certain areas of science politically. It could be dangerous as well. We often, I think, fall in love with whatever is the current theory. You were talking about how they were, once the germ theory of disease had reached its apex and it was understood and not laughed at anymore, then you started getting the extension of it. Oh, old age is caused by. Sometimes I wonder about our current love for DNA, and the microbiome is becoming so large now. You know, you'll wonder how far it's going to go if we start favoring policies towards those things that we just know now and not what we might have known.
I think that one of the main lessons of the Spanish flu was that, for scientists, was that you need to experiment, you need to put your faith in the evidence, you need to always ask questions, you need to always question your own prejudices, and you need to be open to new ideas and new theories. I think it's the nature of science that it swings between extremes until it finds, as more evidence is accumulated. So genes were all the rage, then previously in the environment was all the rage in terms of contribution to many types of disease today. Now we realize that most diseases are a combination of the two. Everything is more complex than it seems to be at the beginning. And we just have to be open and keep working hard and collecting the evidence. That's the only way that science is going to advance.
Let's talk a bit about the H1N1. This is I saw that in your book, like this, the disease we're talking about, the Spanish flu. I feel so bad about repeating it, but there's no other way to identify it and have people understand. It's in the history books now.
We have to resign ourselves to that.
It is the H1N1, is it not?
It's the H1N1, yeah. It's
and that's similar to what hit us in not too long ago.
So the taxonomy of flu is a little hard to get your head around. It's exactly the same subtype, but it's a different strain. I said, flu is a very labile virus. It changes all the time, changes its genetic makeup. But they're very closely related strains, yes.
The swine flu, it's related, but so the reason it didn't have the same impact, it was a little scary, but not the same impact, was maybe some of the virulence and then also public health measures, I suppose.
Yeah, that a lot of the flus that have been circulating in the human population over the last 100 years share a lot of genes. So, our immune systems, the immune systems of everyone alive, probably have some priming towards them, and that's why one of the reasons perhaps why the 2009 pandemic was less virulent than we might have expected. We have the flu vaccine now. We have antiviral drugs. We tend to be, on average, better fed than we were then. All sorts of reasons, and just in general, medical knowledge is much better. But what's interesting is that in 1918, I mean, why was the 2009 pandemic called swine flu? It was a human disease. The reason was that it goes back to 1918, in fact, because in 1918 there was a simultaneous epidemic of flu in pigs, and we now know that was also caused by H1N1, but it was a new disease in pigs, and we now know that it was humans that infected pigs, not the other way around. That virus then circulated in pig populations in the world through the 20th century, and in 2009 it re-emerged in a slightly modified form in humans. So it may have come from pigs, but in fact it was originally a human disease.
how arrogant we are as humans. You know, we are blaming the pigs, and it is us that infected them. We owe them an apology of sorts. You know.
We owe pigs an apology. We definitely do. And I think we have a tendency to think of ourselves as sort of, surrounded by a dangerous natural world, and not to think of ourselves as part of that world. We very much are part of that bigger flu ecosystem. Besides
the flu vaccine, what fights flu today? What are steps that and policies that you could think of that a good government, either local or federal, does?
Well, I think it starts now. That is, with no pandemic on the horizon, although we don't usually get much warning. With education and with inoculation. People have to understand that the flu vaccine is the best protection we have in the face of a future pandemic, and not to wait until that pandemic explodes, because although the strain may be different from the one of vaccines that are available now, there's likely to be some overlap, and everything is priming your immune system against flu. It's better than nothing. And the more people who are vaccinated, should a pandemic arise, the fewer people will die globally. So it starts with education. It starts with inoculation. We have much more in our sort of tool cabinet, if you like, for after the fact. For once the pandemic does explode, we've got antiviral drugs, we've got antibiotic drugs. And apart from that, and again, good nursing, a lot of the things that were effective when they were implemented properly in 1918 are also things that are going to help today or tomorrow in the next pandemic. So public health measures that are collectively known as social distancing, basically they just keep people apart so that the virus can't spread. You could think of the flu vaccine as a social distancing measure, because what it does is it protects one person so that person can't carry the virus to the next. But it also covers things like the banning of mass gatherings, the wearing of protective masks, isolation, quarantine, advice to stay in your home, and to, not go out if you can possibly avoid it until the danger is past.
Those government-imposed measures sometimes people chafe at, but, it's necessary to have some kind of controlling authority to get on that early. I know that there are examples in your book of operas, carnivals, the Carnival in Brazil, just these events that occurred along the time of the flu and were not good timing.
Just to go back to your previous point, people do chafe at these measures. People, especially today, much more than in 1918, don't like the state and authorities intervening in their lives and telling them what to do. And that's perfectly reasonable. But obviously these measures are for our collective good. The authorities do also know that we don't like to be ordered to do things. And they know that it's much better if we do it voluntarily. That's been proven again and again. So once again, that's why it's important that people are educated, people understand why these measures are imposed, and that it's for everybody's benefit. The Rio Carnival is a fascinating example of how people reacted to the Spanish flu, because it was held in around Mardi Gras, of course, in February 1919. The epidemic was all but over in Rio de Janeiro by then, but death was a very recent memory, and people were just sort of realizing how lucky they were to be alive. It was the biggest carnival on record until that date, and the people who attended it essentially went crazy. From the eyewitness testimonies that we have. It turned into a sort of orgy of joy and the fact that I'm still alive. People were celebrating. The party went on for days. They couldn't believe that they'd come through this terrible event. And there was a sort of darker side to it too, in the sense that it looks like there were a lot of rapes in the context of that carnival. And 9 months later, a generation of children were born who are known as the sons of flu.
My guest has been Laura Spinney, a science journalist and literary novelist, and the author of The Pale Rider, Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World. Laura, thanks very much for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure.
And a reminder about the premium podcast from My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. For as little as $2 a month, you can get extra episodes to this podcast. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com.